Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Easy English Spark channel. I'm so excited to have you here today. We've got something really special in store for you. Today, we're diving into a unique story that touches on the power of persistence and finding warmth in unexpected places. Along the way, we'll also work on boosting your English listening and speaking skills by breaking down some real-world scenarios from the story. Let's get started and spark your English journey to a whole new level. Chapter 1: The Cold Wind. It was late afternoon in Brooklyn, and the chill of winter was already in the air. Jason, a man used to the streets, sat alone on a faded, worn bench in the park. He adjusted his thin coat around his body, trying to protect himself from the biting cold that was sweeping through the city. The trees, once lush with leaves, now stood bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward the gray sky above. A light wind blew, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and the unmistakable cold that warned of harsher days ahead. Jason glanced up, watching as a single brown leaf danced in the air before it gently drifted down and landed on his sleeve. The leaf was dead, withered and brown, much like Jason felt in that moment. He pulled his coat tighter around him, as if he could ward off the inevitable. He had spent many winters in the same spot, perched on the same bench, watching as the seasons changed. Each year, the wind felt colder, the nights longer, and the days more difficult to bear. The park around him was quieter now. In summer, it was full of life, children playing, people walking their dogs, couples strolling under the trees. But now, as winter began to creep in, the park felt empty and desolate. Even the usual sounds of the city, cars honking, people shouting, distant sirens, seemed muffled, as if the cold had taken over the entire city. Jason's breath fogged in front of him as he exhaled slowly. He knew the signs of winter all too well. It was always the same. The cold would only get worse, and soon he would be left without shelter. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. For many years he had survived the harsh winters by relying on a simple plan, one he had used over and over again. A plan that, while not ideal, had always worked. He looked around the park once more, his eyes scanning the surroundings. People hurried by, wrapped in scarves and coats, their heads down against the cold. But Jason had no destination, no warmth to seek. His life on the streets had become a routine, a cycle of survival that was growing harder to endure. He knew that in a few hours the sun would set, and the temperature would drop even further. Soon, he would be sitting on this same bench, his only company the biting wind and the distant hum of the city. He needed a solution, something to get him through the long months ahead. Jason had been through this before, and he knew exactly what needed to be done. There was a way out, a way to escape the cold. He could spend the winter in a warm, safe place, a place where the chill couldn't touch him, a place where he wouldn't have to sleep in the park. It was a place he had been before, a place that provided food, heat, and, most importantly, protection from the winter's cruel embrace. That place was prison. The idea was simple. Every winter, when the cold became unbearable, Jason would put his plan into motion. It was always the same. He would find a way to get arrested, whether by causing a scene or getting caught doing something minor. And once the police came, he would be taken to jail, where he could stay warm and safe for the next few months. It was a comfortable routine, one that kept him alive when the world outside was freezing. But getting arrested wasn't as easy as it sounded. Jason shifted on the bench, his body stiff from the cold. He knew he had to act quickly. The longer he waited, the harder it would be to carry out his plan. He had a feeling that this winter it wouldn't be as simple as before. But he couldn't think about that now. He had to focus. Winter was coming, and he needed to make his move soon. He stood up slowly, his joints aching from sitting too long. The cold air hit him immediately, and he pulled his coat tighter, tugging at the collar to shield his neck. He took a deep breath, the crisp air filling his lungs, and started to walk. The city stretched out before him, a maze of concrete and steel, each street lined with buildings that block the warmth of the sun. As Jason walked through the streets, the reality of his situation settled in. He was alone in the world, with no one to turn to, no place to call home. The streets were his only refuge, the only place where he could exist without being judged or ignored. But it wasn't enough anymore. He needed something more. Something that would keep him safe through the cold months ahead. He turned the corner and headed toward the heart of the city. The wind howled around him, biting at his skin. But Jason didn't mind. He had dealt with worse. What mattered now was survival. And for that he needed to get inside. A warm bed, a hot meal, and a few months of peace. That was what he needed, and he knew exactly how to get it. But first, he had to decide how to go about it. There were options, of course. Jason's mind raced through the possibilities. He could try the usual tricks, the schemes that had worked before. Or he could try something new, something that would guarantee him the safety he so desperately craved. The cold wind blew harder, and Jason pulled his coat tighter around him. Winter was coming, and he needed to act fast. Chapter 2. The Idea of Comfort. Jason walked slowly down the bustling streets of Brooklyn, his feet dragging along the cracked sidewalks. He felt the familiar numbness in his fingers, the cold seeping into his bones with each step. The wind seemed to cut right through him, biting at his face and ears. But he was used to it. Winter in the city was harsh, and the chill was something he had learned to endure. However, today, the cold felt more oppressive than usual, almost unbearable. The thought of spending another winter on the streets made him shiver, not just from the cold, but from the very idea of it. He paused at the corner of a busy intersection, waiting for the light to change. He watched the people around him, all wrapped up in their warm coats, scarves, and gloves, hurrying along to their destinations, their faces hidden beneath the protection of their winter gear. He envied them. They had somewhere to go, someone to be with, a place to escape the chill. But Jason? He had no such luxury. No family, no friends, no shelter to call his own. The park bench where he had spent countless nights would be his home for the next few months. And that thought made him feel even colder. But as he stood there, waiting for the light, a thought began to take shape in his mind. It wasn't a new idea. In fact, it was something that had crossed his mind every year when winter came around. It was a solution to the misery of the streets, a way out of the cold, a way to escape the inevitable loneliness of the coming months. The more he thought about it, the more appealing it became. It was an idea he had used before, and it always worked. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the only option left. Prison. The word echoed in his mind. Prison was not a place Jason had ever wanted to be, but the cold, harsh winter was something he had learned to fear more than anything. It wasn't just the freezing nights on the park bench, the lack of warmth, the biting winds, or the empty streets. It was the sense of isolation, the relentless solitude. Winter in the city could be a killer, especially when you had no place to turn to. But prison? Prison was different. There, the cold couldn't touch him. The walls were thick, the meals were hot, and most importantly, he wouldn't be alone. In prison, there were other people, men who, like him, had nowhere else to go. He would have company, warmth, and shelter. No more fighting the wind, no more cold nights, no more desperation. He would be fed, kept safe from the winter, and, in a strange way, he would have a purpose. It wasn't ideal, but it was enough to survive. Jason smiled to himself, almost amused at the simplicity of it. It wasn't the first time he had thought about it, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Every year when winter arrived, he would turn to the same plan. It was a system that worked, even if it was an imperfect one. And the best part? It didn't take much effort. Just a small misstep, a minor offense, and he would be taken away. No one would care. He would have a roof over his head, a warm bed to sleep in, and a few months of peace. The light turned green, and Jason crossed the street, his steps quickening as the idea grew stronger in his mind. He had done it before, and he could do it again. He had always found a way to get arrested, whether it was by causing a scene, stealing something small, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It didn't matter. The authorities always took him in, and once inside, the cold would be nothing more than a distant memory. The days of shivering in the park, of being ignored and invisible, would be over. As he walked down the street, Jason's mind wandered. He thought about the winter nights he had spent in jail, the warmth of the cell, the sounds of men talking, laughing, and sometimes even arguing. It wasn't a perfect place, but it was far better than the alternative. At least, in prison there was food, there was warmth, and there were people around. On the streets there was only the cold, the loneliness, and the constant fight for survival. He turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city fading into the background. Jason was used to being on the move. He had to be. It was the only way to stay one step ahead, to keep out of trouble. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the bitter cold, or maybe it was the growing sense of inevitability that had settled in his chest. No matter how much he hated the idea, no matter how much he longed for a real home, the fact was that prison was his best option. And it would be his escape from the coming winter. As he walked past the rows of closed shops, Jason couldn't help but think about how easy it was. The plan had always been simple, almost foolproof. It didn't require much effort, just a little. Patience and maybe a bit of luck. He had learned over the years what worked and what didn't. He had honed his skills, perfected his approach, and now all he had to do was wait for the right moment. Jason stopped for a moment, leaning against the brick wall of a nearby building. The cold wind whipped past him, and he pulled his coat tighter, shivering slightly. His breath came out in small clouds, the steam vanishing into the frigid air. He closed his eyes for a moment, imagining the warmth of the prison cell, the relief of escaping the cold, the peace that would come with not having to worry about surviving each day. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, of course. The authorities might be more vigilant this time, or perhaps the system would be different. But it didn't matter. He had survived worse. He had learned to adapt, to find solutions, to make it through. And this winter, prison would be his answer. Jason opened his eyes and began walking again, the idea of comfort now firmly planted in his mind. The cold would come, and he would face it, but he wouldn't face it alone. He would be in a warm cell, surrounded by others, free from the winter's cruel grasp. And for the first time in a long while, Jason felt a flicker of hope. The winter might be long, but at least it wouldn't be unbearable. Chapter 3. The Restaurant Scheme. Jason's mind was already racing with thoughts of how to put his plan into action. The streets of Brooklyn were filled with the usual noise of city life, the hum of cars driving by, the chatter of pedestrians hurrying along the sidewalks, and the faint sound of music drifting from a nearby bar. But Jason wasn't paying attention to any of that. His eyes were focused ahead, scanning the street for the perfect opportunity. He needed a place where he could execute his tried-and-true method, get into a nice restaurant, eat a warm meal, and then, when it came time to pay, reveal he had no money. From there, it would be a simple matter of the staff calling the police, and he'd be on his way to a warm cell for the winter. As he walked along the sidewalk, Jason spotted it. Just ahead, a small but upscale-looking restaurant tucked in between a couple of larger buildings. It had large glass windows that reflected the fading sunlight, and inside, Jason could see the soft glow of warm lighting that made it look inviting and comfortable. This was perfect. He could already feel the warmth of the restaurant in his mind, the heat from the kitchen, the scent of freshly cooked food. It was exactly what he needed to get through the night, through the winter. Jason paused in front of the restaurant for a moment, weighing his options. The plan had worked before. He had used it countless times in the past. But there was always the chance that things wouldn't go as smoothly this time. He had to be careful, make sure he didn't mess it up, but he couldn't let the cold keep gnawing at him. He needed warmth, food, and the promise of something better than the miserable bench in the park. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and immediately the warmth of the restaurant wrapped around him like a blanket. It was a small place, but the ambiance was cozy. The smell of cooking food hit him instantly. Roasted meats, freshly baked bread, and something buttery that made his stomach rumble. The soft murmur of conversation from the few patrons who were dining added to the atmosphere, making it feel like a peaceful, inviting space. Jason glanced around and quickly spotted an empty table in the far corner, tucked away from the view of the entrance. It was perfect. Out of sight, but close enough to the kitchen to smell the food. The hostess, a woman in her mid-30s with a friendly smile, approached him as he walked in. "Good evening," she said warmly, her voice soft and polite. "How many in your party?" Jason smiled back, trying to look more presentable than he felt. He wasn't exactly dressed for a fancy dinner, but his coat, though worn, was still serviceable, and his shirt wasn't too shabby. He pulled his shoulders back, trying to give off the impression that he belonged. "Just me," Jason said, his voice calm and measured. "A table for one, please." The hostess led him to the table in the corner, pulling out the chair for him with a practiced gesture. Jason sat down, feeling the warmth from the heating vents beneath the table. For a moment, he just closed his eyes, savoring the warmth that surrounded him. It was a brief escape, but it was enough. Enough to make him forget the cold that had followed him all day. Enough to make him forget the misery of the streets. For now, he could relax. The hostess handed him a menu and asked if he wanted anything to drink. Jason glanced at the menu, seeing the prices. Fairly steep for someone in his situation, but that was part of the plan. It had to be a nice place, one that wouldn't let him get away with not paying. He needed the kind of restaurant where the staff would immediately call the police if he tried to pull his usual trick. If they didn't, he might end up in an even worse situation. "I'll have a glass of water for now," Jason said, and the hostess nodded before walking away to place his order. Jason glanced around the restaurant, taking in the dim lighting, the crisp white tablecloths, and the soft clink of silverware as people ate. He could hear snippets of conversation from nearby tables, and for a moment it almost felt normal, as though he were just another diner out for a meal, like the others. But deep down, he knew this wasn't really him. This wasn't his life, and it wasn't a life he wanted to stay in. But it was a temporary fix, and for now, that was all he needed. The hostess returned shortly with the glass of water, placing it on the table in front of him. "Are you ready to order?" she asked with a polite smile. Jason nodded. He glanced back at the menu, picking something that seemed reasonably priced but still high-end enough for him to get the staff's attention. He ordered a small meal, a soup to start, followed by a modest entree. Nothing extravagant, but enough to make the plan work. He was good at this. He knew how to play the part, how to act like he belonged, even when he didn't. As the minutes passed, Jason sat back in his chair, taking small sips of the water as he waited for his meal. The warmth of the room was slowly starting to melt away the tension in his body. He could feel his muscles relaxing, the weight of the cold disappearing. The longer he sat there, the less he felt like a stranger in the restaurant, the more he felt like just another customer. The smell of food grew stronger, and his stomach growled, reminding him that this meal was long overdue. Finally, the waiter arrived with his soup, placing it gently in front of him. Jason smiled up at him and thanked him, but as he picked up his spoon, he could feel his plan starting to take shape in his mind. He would eat, enjoy the meal, and when it came time to pay, he would simply tell them that he didn't have any money. The police would come, take him away, and he would be set for the winter. As he ate, Jason noticed the other diners around him. They were laughing, talking, enjoying their meals with ease. For a brief moment, he imagined what it would be like to be one of them, people who could come into a restaurant without worrying about being thrown out, people who had homes, families, lives that weren't dictated by the cold in the streets. He quickly pushed the thought aside. This wasn't the time to get distracted. He had a plan, and he was going to stick to it. The soup was delicious, warm, and comforting, and Jason savored each spoonful, letting it fill the empty spaces inside him. When the soup was finished, the waiter returned to take the bowl away, and Jason took a deep breath. It was time. He felt a rush of adrenaline as he made the decision to go through with it, no matter the consequences. "I'll take the check, please," Jason said, trying to sound calm, but his voice betrayed a slight nervousness. He wasn't sure how the staff would react, but he was prepared. The waiter returned moments later with the bill, placing it gently on the table. Jason looked at it for a moment, his heart racing. This was it, the final step. Jason glanced up at the waiter with a look of apology. "I'm sorry, but I don't have any money," he said, his voice steady but just a little too casual. "I suppose I'll have to call the police." The waiter looked at him for a moment, clearly surprised, and then glanced around at the other staff members. Jason felt his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for them to react, to do what he knew they would do, call the authorities and send him off to the warmth of a cell for the winter. But then something unexpected happened. The waiter didn't call for the police. Instead, the waiter just nodded politely and said, "I'm afraid we don't tolerate that here, sir." Before Jason could respond, two other staff members appeared beside him, their hands firm on his shoulders. Without another word, they began guiding him out of the restaurant, and within moments, Jason found himself standing on the cold sidewalk, his warm meal inside him, but the warmth of the restaurant gone. He stood there for a moment, stunned and confused. The plan hadn't worked. The restaurant didn't play by the rules. Jason had been thrown out, not arrested. He stood there, blinking in the harsh cold of the night, his stomach still full, but his mind racing. He had to rethink his approach. The plan had failed, but it wasn't over yet. Chapter 4. Plan Gone Wrong. Jason stood outside the restaurant, still reeling from what had just happened. His breath came out in short, quick bursts, the sharp winter air making each exhale feel colder than the last. He could hardly believe it. Just moments ago, he had been sitting comfortably at a table, enjoying a warm meal, imagining the sweet relief of being taken away by the police, where he would be sheltered from the bitter cold of the streets. But instead, he had been kicked out, unceremoniously thrown into the cold, without so much as a second thought from the restaurant staff. He could still taste the soup on his tongue, the warmth of it lingering in his stomach. But now that warmth was a distant memory, replaced by the biting chill that cut straight through his thin coat. Jason stood for a moment, his shoulders hunched against the cold, trying to process what had just happened. Why hadn't they called the police? Why had they just thrown him out like that, without even offering him a chance to explain himself? He looked up at the restaurant, still glowing warmly through the windows. Inside, he could see the other diners, oblivious to what had just happened. The scene felt surreal. He had been sitting there, one of them, just moments ago. Now he was nothing more than another man on the street, just one more face in the crowd of the forgotten. Jason sighed deeply and shook his head. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The plan was simple, tried and tested. Sit, eat, and when the time came, announce he had no money. The police would come, and he'd be taken to jail for the winter. It was a surefire way to survive the season, one that had worked every other time. But tonight, something had gone wrong. The restaurant hadn't played along. He had been escorted out, and the promise of warmth and safety had vanished into the night, leaving him standing alone and cold on the sidewalk. Jason stuffed his hands into his pockets and turned away from the restaurant, his heart heavy with frustration. He needed to think of something else. Fast. As he walked down the street, the cold wind pushed against him, making his progress slower, more labored. The night was darker now, the city lights casting long shadows across the streets. He needed warmth, shelter, and quickly. The benches in the park were already occupied, and he didn't want to return there anyway. He needed a new plan, and he needed it now. He wandered aimlessly for a few minutes, his mind racing with possibilities. What other options did he have? He could try another restaurant, but what if it was the same situation? What if they too just tossed him out? He didn't have the energy to go through the humiliation again. No, he had to come up with something different. Jason's eyes wandered over the street, searching for inspiration, something that might give him the break he so desperately needed. And that's when he saw it. Across the street, nestled between two buildings, was a small, run-down shop. The window was cracked, the paint peeling away, but there was a faint light inside. It wasn't much, but it was a place he could try. Without thinking, Jason crossed the street, the cold pavement beneath his shoes clicking as he walked. His fingers tightened around the edges of his coat, and he stepped into the small shop. The shop was dimly lit, with shelves stocked with various odds and ends, old clothes, broken furniture, discarded trinkets. It wasn't a place where people went for pleasure, but it was the kind of place where someone like Jason might find what he needed. The air inside was musty and thick with the scent of old wood and dust, but it was warmer than the street outside. Behind the counter stood a thin, middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, eyeing Jason as he entered. Jason didn't make eye contact at first. Instead, he scanned the room, looking for something that might be of use. His mind was racing again, the frustration from the restaurant failure still fresh in his chest. But he couldn't let that stop him. He needed to push forward. He couldn't afford to let this slip by. Jason walked to a shelf near the back of the store, where he found a few small items, tools, books, and other miscellaneous things. His eyes landed on a small, old umbrella leaning against the wall. It wasn't much, but it would do. He could grab it, walk out, and the man behind the counter would likely call the police. It wasn't ideal, but it was a chance that might finally get him to where he needed to be. Without thinking twice, Jason reached out and grabbed the umbrella. As soon as his fingers closed around the handle, the man behind the counter stood up, his eyes narrowing. "Hey!" the man called out, his voice sharp. "What do you think you're doing?" Jason froze, the umbrella still in his hand. For a brief moment, he thought about putting it back, about walking out of the shop and trying something else. But the opportunity was too perfect. He couldn't back down now. This was his chance. He turned slowly to face the man. "I'm just borrowing this for a bit," Jason said, trying to sound casual, though his heart was pounding in his chest. It's just a small thing. I'll be right back with it." The man's expression darkened, and he took a step toward Jason. "You're not going anywhere with that umbrella," he said, his voice firm. "Put it down and get out of my store." Jason hesitated. He had done this before, taken things, small things, hoping to get caught. But this felt different. There was something in the man's eyes that made Jason feel like he wasn't going to get away with it this time. Still, he held his ground. "Call the police," Jason said, trying to muster some bravado. "It's your umbrella, right? Then call them. I'll wait." The man's brow furrowed, and for a moment, Jason thought maybe it had worked. Maybe the police would show up, and he'd finally get his wish. He could already picture the warmth of the jail cell, the relief of no longer being cold, alone. But then, something unexpected happened. The man just stared at him for a long moment, and Jason could see him thinking, weighing his options. Finally, with a sigh, the man shook his head and muttered something under his breath. "You know what? Forget it. I don't have time for this." He turned his back on Jason and walked to the counter, muttering about how people like him were always causing trouble. Jason stood there for a moment, stunned. It hadn't worked. The man hadn't called the police. He hadn't done anything. Jason blinked, the reality of the situation slowly settling in. The plan had failed again. As he walked out of the store, umbrella still in hand, Jason felt a deep sense of frustration and defeat. Nothing was working. Nothing was going the way it was supposed to. He had tried everything, and every time he was left without the one thing he wanted most, a safe, warm place to survive the winter. With the umbrella hanging limply from his hand, Jason walked back onto the cold street, feeling more lost and desperate than ever. He had failed again, and the winter was still just beginning. Chapter 5. The Window Trick. Jason walked down the busy street, his mind a whirlwind of frustration and failure. The restaurant scheme had been a bust. The umbrella trick hadn't worked either. Every time he thought he had the perfect plan, something went wrong. He felt the weight of his failures pressing on him with every step. The cold wind had picked up again, biting into his skin, and his breath came out in clouds of mist. His stomach growled, but the hunger didn't bother him as much as the gnawing feeling of desperation. He needed to find a way out of this cold, a way to escape the relentless winter that was closing in on him. As he walked through the city, Jason's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of opportunity. He had to act quickly. He couldn't stay out here much longer. The park bench, his usual refuge, was already out of the question. Too many people had seen him there recently, and the last thing he wanted was attention. He needed something new, something different. He needed something that would get him arrested, something that would put him behind the warm iron bars of a jail cell. And then, as if the universe had heard his thoughts, Jason's eyes landed on something. It was a small shop, tucked between two larger buildings, its window displaying an array of shiny trinkets and antique goods. The window was large, and the display seemed almost too perfect, each item placed carefully, gleaming in the dim light of the street lamps. It was a quiet, unassuming store, with no one inside and no one paying attention. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he considered the possibilities. This was it. This could work. He had done this before. He had broken windows to get attention, to get arrested. It was a trick he had used once or twice, but it had always been successful. The police would arrive in minutes, and Jason would be carted off to jail. The warm cell, the shelter, the peace. He could almost taste it, the comfort that awaited him. The thought pushed him forward, and before he knew it, he was standing just a few feet away from the shop's display window. The shop was quiet, and the street was nearly empty. Jason looked around quickly, making sure no one was watching, but the area seemed deserted. He was in the clear. He reached out and pressed his palm against the cool glass of the window, his fingers tracing the contours of the shiny items displayed. Inside, it would be easy. A quick move, a shattered window, and the police would come. The plan was simple, and Jason was sure this time it would work. He took a deep breath and stepped back, surveying the window once again. There was a small stone lying on the ground just a few feet away, weathered by time but perfect for what he needed. Without hesitation, Jason bent down and picked it up, his fingers curling around the rough surface. He could feel the weight of the stone in his hand, the jagged edges pressing into his palm. It felt right. This was going to be it. With his eyes fixed on the window, Jason raised his arm, taking careful aim at the glass. He didn't want to waste any time. The moment the glass shattered, everything would change. He would be inside a warm cell, away from the cold, safe from the world outside. The tension in his body built as he focused on the target. His arm swung forward, and the stone flew through the air. There was a loud crash as the stone connected with the window. Glass splintered and shattered, sending shards flying in all directions. The noise echoed down the empty street, the sharp sound of breaking glass ringing in Jason's ears. For a moment, everything was still. The shop window stood there, the jagged pieces of glass hanging in midair, the pieces slowly falling to the ground below. Jason's heart raced. It had worked. The window was broken. The police would come, just as they always did. He could already feel the rush of warmth, the relief of being taken in, away from the streets. His hands were shaking, with anticipation as he stood still, waiting for the inevitable. But the minutes ticked by and no one came. No sirens, no flashing lights, no police rushing to the scene. Jason stood frozen in place, his eyes darting back and forth, expecting someone to appear. But nothing happened. The street remained eerily quiet, the wind whistling softly through the cracks in the buildings. Jason's breath came out in ragged bursts as his frustration grew. This was supposed to work. It always worked. Why wasn't anyone coming? He glanced around quickly, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. The shop owner? Maybe they hadn't noticed yet. Maybe it was too quiet, too far from the main road. Maybe they hadn't heard the glass break. But there was no way the sound of shattering glass could have gone unnoticed. Jason's eyes shifted nervously to the street corner, searching for a policeman, a passerby, anyone who might be able to help him make sense of this mess. But no one was there. He stood motionless, his heart sinking lower with each passing second. He had made his move, broken the window, and still no one came. He had prepared for this. He had practiced this scenario in his mind over and over, but the reality of it was far different than he had imagined. Where were the police? Where were the people? Where was the warmth? Jason stood there, still clutching the stone in his hand, unsure of what to do next. Should he leave? Should he try to break another window? Should he walk away, go somewhere else and try his luck again? The cold started to creep back in, nipping at his skin, and for a moment, Jason thought about abandoning the whole thing, heading back to the park bench and trying to survive the winter as he had so many times before. But no. That wasn't an option. He couldn't go back to that cold, empty bench. He couldn't bear it. Jason turned around, looking up and down the street again. The silence was maddening, the weight of the failure heavy on his chest. Then, just as he was about to give up, he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. Jason spun around, his heart leaping in his chest. But it was only a man walking toward him, his face buried in the collar of his coat to shield himself from the wind. He didn't even look at Jason as he passed, his attention focused ahead. Jason's shoulders slumped in defeat. The plan had failed again. The window trick hadn't worked. The police hadn't arrived. The hope of being taken to the warmth of a prison cell was slipping further away with every passing minute. He had no choice but to walk away, back into the cold, back into the streets, where the night would swallow him whole. With a final glance at the broken window, Jason turned on his heel and walked slowly down the street. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of failure pressing down on him. But the winter was far from over, and Jason knew he couldn't give up. He had to keep trying. There had to be a way to get what he needed. There had to be a way to survive this winter. And with that thought, Jason disappeared into the night, already planning his next move. Chapter 6. A Missed Opportunity. Jason trudged down the street, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cold was biting, relentless, gnawing at his bones, and his thin coat barely offered any protection. The dark of night had fallen fully over the city, casting long shadows across the sidewalks, and the harsh winds whipped around him, pushing him further into the depths of his frustration. His stomach growled again, reminding him that he hadn't eaten much today. But hunger was the least of his worries now. The warmth of the restaurant, the comfort of the jail cell, both seemed so far away now, almost unreachable. He had tried everything he could think of. First, the restaurant scheme, then the umbrella trick, followed by the broken window plan. Each time his efforts had been thwarted. No matter what he did, the goal he sought, the warmth of a prison cell, remained just out of his grasp. The city around him seemed like a cruel reminder of his failures, each flickering streetlight mocking him as he walked past. Jason turned a corner and walked down a quieter side street, looking for something, anything that might give him another opportunity. He was tired of trying, tired of failing, tired of the cold. But giving up wasn't an option. Not yet. He couldn't let himself fall back into that miserable routine, the cold, lonely nights on the park bench. Not again. As he passed a small, dimly lit alleyway, Jason's eyes caught sight of something that made him pause. Just a few yards ahead, near a crowded corner, he saw a policeman standing under the glow of a street lamp, casually chatting with a man who appeared to be waiting for a bus. The officer wasn't paying much attention, his back turned to the street, his attention focused elsewhere. Jason's pulse quickened. The opportunity was right there, right in front of him. He knew this was his chance. The policeman was close, and if he could manage to catch the officer's attention, maybe this time, he would be taken to jail. There was no time to waste, no hesitation. The cold seemed to slip away as a single thought consumed Jason. This is it. He glanced over at a young woman standing across the street near a store window. She was bundled up in a thick scarf and coat, but there was something about her. Maybe it was the way she looked so unaware of what was happening around her. Maybe it was the way she seemed vulnerable in the night air that made Jason feel he could make his move. If he approached her, struck up a conversation, made a comment about her walking with him, maybe the policeman would notice. Maybe the officer would see the situation, see that Jason was causing a disturbance, and come over to investigate. Everything seemed to fall into place in Jason's mind as he walked across the street, heading straight for the woman. He moved slowly at first, trying to appear casual, as if he were simply making his way down the sidewalk. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his mind was laser-focused on the task ahead. This was the moment. The policeman was still there, his back to the street. All Jason had to do was engage the woman, make her notice him, and then let the police officer see it all. Jason reached the woman and stood for a moment, just watching her. She was staring intently into the store window, her face lit by the soft glow of the overhead lights. He could hear the faint rustle of her coat as she shifted her weight, seemingly lost in thought. He took a breath, preparing himself. This was the moment that would get him out of the cold. His hands were clammy, his heart beating faster than it should, but he couldn't back out now. He cleared his throat softly, then took a step closer to her, leaning in just enough so that she would hear him. "Why don't you come with me?" he said smoothly, trying to keep his voice casual yet inviting. "I could show you a good time. I know the best places in town." Jason smiled to himself, the words coming easier than he expected. This was his angle. He would offer her a chance, and the policeman would surely step in. It would be a mess. He knew that, but it didn't matter. All he needed was for the officer to come over and arrest him. That was it. Just a quick, simple interaction, and everything would fall into place. But then, something unexpected happened. The woman didn't react in the way he had hoped. She didn't flinch, didn't take a step back. Instead, she glanced up at him, her eyes briefly meeting his before she turned her attention back to the store window. She didn't seem alarmed. She didn't look afraid. She simply tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Jason felt his confidence falter for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. He couldn't afford to lose this chance. Not now. He took a deep breath and tried again, stepping closer, this time slightly more insistent. "Come on, I'm serious. If you come with me, I can show you a really good time. Let's go before that policeman sees us." This time, the woman glanced at him fully, and Jason's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't scared. She wasn't repelled. In fact, she smiled at him, a small but knowing smile, as if she had figured him out completely. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice calm, but with a hint of playfulness. "But only if you buy me a drink first, and we need to hurry before that cop over there sees us." Jason froze for a moment, stunned by her response. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to be terrified, to react the way he expected, calling out for help or retreating in fear. Instead, she was playing along, almost as if she were the one in control. For a second, Jason felt a wave of confusion and uncertainty wash over him. But no matter what, he couldn't afford to lose this opportunity. This could still work. He forced a smile, trying to mask his inner hesitation. "Of course," he said, trying to sound confident, though his voice shook slightly. "Let's go." The woman linked her arm with his, and together they began to walk away from the policeman, who still hadn't noticed them. Jason felt a wave of discomfort as they walked side by side. This wasn't how he envisioned it. The situation felt off, like something was slipping through his fingers. He glanced back at the officer, but the man had his attention fixed elsewhere, completely unaware of what was happening behind him. Jason felt the weight of his own nerves and uncertainty growing. This wasn't what he had planned. This wasn't how it was supposed to unfold. But now, in the presence of the young woman, his mind started to second-guess everything. What was he doing? Was this really the way to get arrested? Or was he just going to make another mistake? At the next street corner, with the policeman still nowhere in sight, Jason abruptly pulled away from the woman. Fear had begun to creep in, a realization that he wasn't sure he wanted the attention of the officer anymore, not if it meant getting tangled in something he didn't understand. The woman was still smiling, looking at him as if she had been playing a game. She didn't seem concerned, and that made Jason even more uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," Jason muttered, taking a step back. "I think I made a mistake." The woman raised an eyebrow and shrugged, as if it didn't matter much to her. "Suit yourself," she said coolly before turning away and walking down the street, disappearing into the night. Jason stood there for a moment, his pulse racing. He had just lost his chance. Again. The policeman, oblivious to the whole scene, was still chatting away at the street corner, and now the woman was gone. Everything he had planned, Everything he had worked for in that brief moment of hope had slipped away. He let out a long, exhausted sigh and walked back toward the alley, feeling more defeated than ever. Another missed opportunity. Another failure. The night stretched on and the cold crept back into his bones. Chapter 7. The Diner Dilemma. Jason had been walking for hours, and with each step, the cold seemed to settle deeper into his bones. The streets of Brooklyn were still busy with late-night traffic, the hum of cars and the shuffle of hurried feet filling the night air. But to Jason, it all felt distant, muffled, as if he were walking through a fog that only he could see. The lights from the storefronts flickered dimly as he passed, the neon signs casting brief flashes of color across his path. His stomach growled again, louder this time, reminding him that he hadn't had a proper meal in far too long. The diner, a small, unassuming establishment tucked between two larger buildings, came into view just ahead. It was a place Jason had passed by countless times before, but had never stopped at. The neon sign above the door buzzed softly, its faded letters spelling out "open" in a tired, blinking rhythm. Inside, through the large glass windows, he could see the warm glow of fluorescent lights, the faint clatter of dishes, and the shapes of people seated at tables, eating their meals in peace. Jason paused for a moment, standing just outside the diner's door. He had been planning for a long time to try something like this. A simple plan, one that didn't require much effort, but still held the potential to get him exactly what he needed. All he had to do was walk in, sit down, order a meal. And when it came time to pay, he would tell the staff that he had no money. In a place like this, with a no-nonsense attitude toward customers, the police would surely be called, and Jason would be carted off to jail in no time. The thought of a warm cell, a bed to sleep in, and food to fill his stomach made his pulse race with anticipation. It seemed like a foolproof plan. At least it had worked in the past. Jason shook off the doubts that had been creeping in for hours. He had to do this. He had to push forward. There was no other option. His body ached. His mind was foggy with hunger and frustration, but he could still taste the promise of warmth and comfort in his mind. This diner could be his way out. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, the soft chime of the bell above his head breaking the silence as he entered. Immediately, the warmth hit him. Pleasant, enveloping warmth that washed over his cold, tired body like a wave. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling food. The diner was small but cozy, with red vinyl, Booths and a long counter with stools where a few lonely figures sat, eating their meals in silence. A couple of the booths were occupied, but there were still a few empty ones, and the place seemed quiet enough that Jason could slip in unnoticed. That waitress behind the counter looked up as he approached. She was a middle-aged woman with dark circles under her eyes, dressed in the familiar black and white uniform. She gave him a nod and a tired smile, the kind of smile someone gives when they've seen 1,000 faces like his before, when they know the routine and the game being played. "Sit anywhere you like," she said, her voice steady but faintly weary. Jason hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the room, and then he chose a booth by the window in the far corner. He slid into the seat, trying to appear casual, trying to suppress the nervous energy that buzzed inside him. He couldn't afford to make a scene? Not yet. The waitress followed him to the booth, giving him a brief glance as she took a menu from the small rack beside the door. "What can I get you?" she asked, her pen already poised over the order pad. Jason opened the ghee menu in front of him, though he barely looked at it. He had already decided what he would order. Something simple, something inexpensive. He didn't need to draw attention. The goal was to blend in, to act like any other customer. He needed to make it believable, to play the part perfectly. The last thing he needed was for the waitress to question him or become suspicious. He could already picture the police arriving, the officer walking in and taking him away. It was all just a matter of time now. "I'll have the soup of the day," Jason said, trying to sound casual. "And a coffee." The waitress nodded and scribbled down his order, then turned to leave. Jason leaned back in the booth, closing his eyes for a moment. The warmth of the diner, the soft clatter of plates and silverware, all of it felt so foreign to him, so comforting, so out of reach. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, to imagine what it would be like to have a steady life again. The simple pleasure of a warm meal, a clean bed, a roof over his head. Those were luxuries he hadn't known in a long time. The thought made his stomach tighten, not just with hunger, but with a deep, aching longing for something more. But no, he couldn't let himself think like that. Not now. He had a plan, and it had to work. He had no choice. A few minutes later, the waitress returned with his coffee and the soup. She placed the bowl in front of him with a brief, perfunctory smile, and Jason nodded in thanks. He took a sip of the coffee, letting the warmth spread through him. It was strong, bitter, but it did the trick. He needed something to steady his nerves, something to take the edge off his anxiety. The soup was steaming hot, a welcome relief to his cold body. Jason picked up his spoon and took a small taste. It was nothing fancy, just a basic vegetable soup, but it tasted like a luxury to him. It didn't matter. All that mattered now was that he had to make it through this without making a mistake. He could feel the weight of the plan building inside him, the pressure growing as he thought about what would happen next. In a few minutes, when he was finished eating, he would call for the check. He would tell the waitress that he had no money, and just like that, the game would be over. The police would arrive, and he would be arrested. It was simple, straightforward, and then finally, he would be free from the cold, free from the streets. It would all be over, and the warmth he craved would be his. But as Jason sat there, spooning the soup into his mouth, something unexpected happened. His mind started to wander. The warmth of the diner, the simple joy of eating a hot meal. He hadn't realized how much he missed it until now. The thought of the police arriving, taking him away, pulling him back into that familiar routine of prison life, suddenly felt less appealing. What if it didn't work? What if the police didn't come? What if the staff just kicked him out again, like they had in that restaurant earlier? Jason looked around the diner once more, his gaze shifting from the other patrons to the waitress behind the counter. He was sitting there, enjoying a warm meal, and the reality of his situation started to sink in. He was so used to running, so used to finding ways out of situations. But here, in this simple diner, in the warmth of the food and the gentle hum of the room, he realized something. He didn't want to keep running anymore. For a fleeting moment, the idea of staying here, of not going through with the plan, crossed his mind. Could he just walk out, pay for the meal, and leave? Could he try something different, something that didn't involve the cold, the police, the jail cell? The thought terrified him. But there was a small spark of hope buried deep inside him, one he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. But that spark faded just as quickly as it had appeared. Jason knew he couldn't stop now. He had come too far. He had to finish what he had started. So, with a deep sigh, he set his spoon down and looked up at the waitress. "I'll need the check," he said, his voice steady, though his hands were beginning to tremble. The waitress nodded, and as she turned away to grab the check, Jason braced himself. This was it. The moment of truth. His future would be decided in the next few minutes. Would it be the warmth of a prison cell, or would he be left out in the cold, just another lost soul in the city? The waitress returned, placing the check in front of him. Jason glanced down at it, his heart pounding. He knew what he had to do. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, his heart sinking. "But I don't have any money. Could you please call the police?" The waitress looked at him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she said nothing. She simply turned and walked away without a word. Jason sat there, waiting, wondering if this time it would work. But the minutes dragged on, and no one came. The cold air outside seemed to seep back into the diner, slowly creeping into his bones. Chapter 8. The Bold Approach. Jason felt the weight of his own failure settling in once more as he stepped out of the diner, the door creaking shut behind him. His heart was heavy with disappointment, his stomach still gnawing at him with hunger. But that wasn't what was bothering him the most. What bothered him was the sense of helplessness creeping into his bones. The plan hadn't worked, not in the restaurant, not with the umbrella, not with the window trick. And now he was back out on the street with no clear direction. The night was deepening, the cold wind cutting through his coat like a blade, making him want to retreat back into his mind, to slip away from everything. But Jason knew he couldn't. He couldn't afford to give up. Not yet. His thoughts were racing. Now he had to find a way. He had to push through, even if it meant trying something he had never done before. As he walked down the street, the familiar buzz of the city filled his ears. The distant hum of traffic, the echo of footsteps on the sidewalk, and the occasional burst of laughter from a group of people huddled together outside a bar. Jason's eyes flicked around as he walked, trying to ignore the unease that swirled in his chest. This was the part of the night when the street started to feel emptier, quieter, fewer people out and about, the streets beginning to feel colder, emptier. That's when he saw her. Across the street, a young woman stood in front of a small boutique, peering into the window at the items on display. She was alone, her back slightly turned as she adjusted her scarf against the chill in the air. Her posture was relaxed, but there was something in her presence that made Jason stop in his tracks. It wasn't her beauty, though she was attractive, but the way she stood there, lost in thought, unaware of the world around her. It seemed like the perfect opportunity. Jason's pulse quickened as he watched her for a moment longer. The plan that had been running through his mind, a plan he had never tried before, began to take shape. He didn't know why, but something about the woman, something about the timing, felt different. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was that small flicker of hope still burning inside him. He had never been one to approach strangers like this, not in such a bold way. But tonight was different. He had nothing left to lose. Without thinking too much about it, Jason took a deep breath and crossed the street, making his way toward the woman. His heart raced, but his steps were steady, purposeful. As he got closer, he adjusted his coat around him, his mind trying to calculate his approach, his words. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say. He had to be quick, have a reason, a story, something to get her to pay attention to him, something to make her call the police. Jason slowed his pace as he reached the curb, a few feet away from her, but just as he was about to speak, the woman turned slightly, glancing up at him. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Jason felt the air around them thicken. He paused, his mouth slightly open, unsure for a moment whether to continue. She didn't look alarmed. She didn't look afraid. She simply looked at him, waiting. Jason cleared his throat, trying to push the nervous energy out of his chest. He had already made the decision, and now he had to follow through. There was no turning back. "Hey," he began, his voice smooth but low. "Why don't you come with me? I know a place where we could have a good time." It wasn't the most elegant opening line, but it was direct. He was laying his cards out on the table. The goal was simple: get her attention, get her to react, and make sure that a nearby policeman noticed. Once the officer arrived, he would get arrested, and finally, his winter nightmare would be over. He could almost taste it: the warmth, the food, the bed. The woman didn't pull back in fear. Instead, she studied him for a moment, as if weighing something in her mind. Jason felt his confidence falter for a split second, but then she smiled. Just slightly, a knowing smile that told him she wasn't fooled. Still, she didn't move. Jason's pulse quickened, but he pressed on. This could still work. "Come on," he said, trying to sound more convincing. "Let's go. I can show you. A good time. You'll like it. We'll be out of here before the cops even notice us." This time, the woman looked around the street, glancing briefly at the policeman on the corner, who was busy talking to a man waiting for a taxi. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Was she looking for help? Was she about to call out for help? But no, she didn't move away. Instead, her eyes met his again, and this time her expression shifted, like she had made a decision. "If you really want to go," she said, her voice playful, "I'll come with you, but only if you buy me a drink. Let's make it quick, and we'd better get away before that cop sees us." Jason froze for a moment. She was playing along? His initial sense of doubt had begun to swirl in his chest, but he quickly squashed it. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The police officer was right there, and she was offering to come with him. Jason took a steadying breath and, against all of his usual hesitation, nodded quickly. "Okay," he said, his voice a little sharper now. Drink, and then we get out of here." He extended his arm, and the woman linked hers with his, a soft laugh escaping her lips. Together, they began to walk down the street, Jason's eyes constantly flicking toward the officer on the corner, hoping for some sign that this was actually going to work. The policeman, however, hadn't noticed them yet. The world seemed to slow down for a moment as Jason's anxiety climbed, but the woman walked beside him without a hint of urgency. She didn't seem rushed, didn't seem to care much about what he had said or about the situation unfolding around them. Jason's mind was spinning. Had he done it? Would the officer finally come over, make his move, and take him away to a warm, safe place where he wouldn't have to deal with the cold anymore? Or had he made a mistake? But as they walked, a sense of doubt crept into his thoughts. The policeman hadn't even moved. He was still chatting with the other man, and the street was eerily quiet around them. The woman, for all her casual demeanor, wasn't acting the way Jason had expected. She wasn't scared, she wasn't running, she was just calm. At the next corner, without any warning, Jason pulled his arm away from her. Fear flashed through him like a lightning bolt. The officer wasn't coming, wasn't reacting, and the situation was spiraling. He hadn't been arrested. Instead, Jason was walking alongside this stranger. Someone who seemed perfectly fine with the situation, as though she had no idea that the man next to her was desperate to end up behind bars. Jason stopped in his tracks and turned toward her. He shook his head, suddenly uncertain. I'm sorry," he muttered, almost to himself. "I think I made a mistake." The woman raised an eyebrow, but didn't seem surprised by his sudden change in demeanor. She just shrugged, unfazed by the abrupt shift. "No worries," she said, with a small smile. "It's all good." She turned and walked away from him, leaving Jason standing on the corner, his heart pounding in his chest. The policeman was still there, still oblivious to the exchange, and Jason felt the weight of failure settle over him once more. For a moment, he stood there in the cold, staring after the woman as she disappeared into the distance. He had been so sure this would work. He had been so certain that this would finally be his escape. But instead, it had all slipped through his fingers again. Jason let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his hands over his face as he walked back toward the empty street corner. He had failed again. Chapter 9. The Final Attempt. Jason's feet dragged as he walked down the dimly lit streets, his body exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the past few hours. The city, once filled with possibilities, now seemed like an endless stretch of concrete, cold and indifferent. The longer he walked, the more he felt the cold pressing in on him, like an invisible force wrapping around his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. His coat, once his shield, now felt thin and inadequate against the sharp bite of the night air. The wind had picked up again, howling down the street as if mocking him, reminding him of how futile his attempts had been. The plan had fallen apart at every turn. The restaurant had thrown him out. The umbrella had done nothing but lead to more confusion. The broken window? A failure. The woman he had tried to use to get arrested had walked away without a second thought, leaving him standing there like a fool. And now, here he was, back on the streets, with nothing but the cold wind and his own mounting frustration as company. As Jason walked aimlessly, the sound of his boots echoing in the quiet street, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that he was running out of time. Winter wasn't waiting for him to get it right. The days were growing shorter, the nights longer, and the cold was becoming unbearable. Every step felt like a countdown, a ticking clock reminding him of what was at stake. But Jason wasn't ready to give up, not yet. He couldn't afford to. He had made it this far, and he had to see it through. He wasn't just fighting the cold. He was fighting for his own sense of dignity, for something resembling a chance at survival. He couldn't spend another night freezing on a park bench. He couldn't go back to that feeling of hopelessness. His mind raced as he wandered deeper into the heart of the city. The lights grew brighter here, more vibrant, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. He passed a few people, some walking, hurriedly with their heads down, others lingering outside bars, chatting and laughing. But Jason felt like a ghost, invisible to them, a part of the scenery that didn't belong, didn't matter. But then, as he rounded the corner, something caught his eye. A new scene, one that wasn't like the rest. The theater district. It was bustling, filled with people, some dressed in their finest clothes, others just happy to be out on a Friday night. The bright marquees above the theaters lit up the street, casting a dazzling glow on the crowds below. There were flashes of laughter and conversation, the sound of heels clicking against the pavement, the smell of food and perfume in the air. It was a stark contrast to the loneliness Jason had felt all evening, and it hit him like a wave of desperation. Here, in the middle of it all, Jason saw the opportunity he had been searching for. He had been walking down the street, defeated by failure, but now, here it was. An opportunity. A man was standing near a theater entrance, waiting to cross the street, holding an umbrella. His back was slightly turned, and he was distracted, looking down at his phone. Jason could feel the tension in the air. This was it. He couldn't waste it. He glanced around, quickly scanning the street. A police officer stood across the street, near the corner, his back to the theater, watching. The crowds. Jason's heart raced. This was the break he needed, the opportunity to finally get arrested. If he could just grab the umbrella, cause a scene, the officer would surely notice. The police would come, take him away, and he'd be out of the cold. His stomach twisted at the thought of finally being done with it, finally escaping the harsh reality of the streets. Jason took a deep breath, his hands shaking. He wasn't sure if it was fear or the anticipation of success, but it didn't matter now. The moment had come, and he couldn't back down. Without thinking, he made his move. He stepped forward, quick and deliberate, reaching out for the umbrella. His fingers closed around the handle, and for a split second, he felt a sense of triumph. The plan was working. He could already imagine the police officer's reaction. The moment the officer would come over, arrest him, and he would finally be taken to the warmth of the jail cell. It was all happening just as he had planned. But then the man with the umbrella turned, and everything froze. The man's eyes locked onto Jason's, his face a mixture of confusion and annoyance. Before Jason could say anything, the man took a step forward, his voice sharp and angry. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, grabbing for the umbrella. Jason didn't have time to react before the man yanked the umbrella out of his hands. It happened so quickly that Jason barely had time to register the man's movements before he was standing there, empty-handed, looking foolish in the middle of the street. The man glared at him, his face red with irritation, and for a moment, Jason just stood there frozen. But then, in that same moment, Jason's eyes flicked across the street. The policeman had seen it all. The officer was moving toward them, his steps deliberate. Jason's heart leaped in his chest. This was it. He had been spotted. The officer was coming over. This was the break he had been waiting for. Jason took a step back, ready to let the officer take over. This was it, the end of the long, cold night. The warmth of the cell was just a moment away. But then, the officer passed by him, walking right past the scene without so much as a glance. Jason felt his blood run cold as the officer continued down the street, completely ignoring him. The Man with the umbrella, still furious, shook his head and muttered something under his breath before walking away, leaving Jason standing alone in the street. Jason stood there, his mind racing. The police officer hadn't even stopped. He had been so close to getting what he needed. But once again, he had been overlooked, ignored. The officer hadn't even considered that Jason might be the one causing the disturbance. The moment stretched on, the silence growing heavier by the second. Jason's chest tightened, and for the first time that night, he felt something close to panic. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. He had done everything right. He had planned it perfectly. But somehow, it wasn't enough. It never was. Defeated, Jason took a few slow steps back, away from the scene. His legs felt like lead, his mind clouded with frustration and disbelief. He had tried and tried and tried again, but the cold still hung over him, relentless, unforgiving. He looked back at the officer who was now talking to a woman further down the street, and Jason felt a sharp pang of disappointment. The warmth of a prison cell, the safety from the cold, seemed as distant as ever. The streets stretched out before him, empty and full of possibility, and yet he had nothing left. Jason turned away, walking back in the direction he had come, from the night swallowing him up as he disappeared into the shadows of the city. Another failure, another missed opportunity. But Jason was used to failure by now, and the winter was far from over. Chapter 10. The Ironic End. Jason's feet felt heavy as he trudged back down the street, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his failures. The night had dragged on, and the chill of the air, once biting, now felt like an impenetrable force, settling in the marrow of his bones. The crowd had thinned, the lively buzz of the city gradually fading into a dull hum. The bright lights of the theater district were behind him now, leaving him in a darker, quieter part of the city. The streets seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of failure, frustration, and defeat. Each of his attempts, each of his carefully crafted plans, had fallen apart. He had tried everything, used every trick in the book, and still the warmth of a prison cell remained just out of reach. The cold was growing more intense, gnawing at his body, creeping into his thoughts. It was becoming harder to think, harder to breathe, as if the weight of the world was pressing in on him. Jason paused on the corner of a quiet street, staring down the empty sidewalk. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his coat wrapped tightly around him, but it did little to fend off the cold. His breath came out in soft clouds, disappearing into the dark night. He felt hopeless, utterly defeated. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to deny him the one thing he craved: escape from the harsh reality of the streets. As he stood there, the weight of everything pressing down on him, Jason's eyes flicked to the side. There, across the street, in the middle of an otherwise empty block, was something unexpected. A small old church stood nestled between two large buildings. It was an unusual sight, tucked away in the city's chaotic landscape, its tall spires rising above the surrounding buildings like a beacon of hope. The soft light from within the church streamed through the stained glass windows, casting a warm, inviting glow into the street. Something about the sight of it stopped Jason in his tracks. He wasn't a religious man. He hadn't been to church in years. But in that moment, the sight of that quiet, peaceful place felt like a lifeline. For a brief moment, the hustle and chaos of the city seemed to fade away, replaced by a sense of calm, a sense of possibility. Jason stood there for several long moments, staring at the church. The cold wind howled around him, but he didn't feel it. The world seemed to quiet as he thought about the days long past, the days when things were different. He remembered when he was younger, when he had a family, a home, and a life that felt whole. He remembered the warmth of good memories, the love he once had, and the dreams he once held. But all of that seemed so far away now. Those days were lost to time, swallowed up by mistakes, by the cold emptiness of the streets. Jason had drifted further and further from those memories, from the person he once was. He had become a stranger to himself, a man who had given up on everything except survival. And yet, here he was, standing in front of this quiet church, the soft glow of the stained glass windows beckoning him. In that moment, Jason realized something profound. He was tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of chasing a life that seemed so far beyond his reach. Maybe this was the time to change. For the first time in what felt like years, Jason felt a flicker of something resembling hope. It wasn't much, just a tiny spark, barely enough to light the way. But it was there. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop chasing the warmth of a prison cell, to stop trying to escape into something that wasn't even a real solution. Maybe it was time to change. He took a step toward the church, his legs moving more easily than they had all night. the za. Cold didn't seem so harsh anymore. As he moved closer, he could hear the faint sound of music. Soft, beautiful, almost haunting, as it drifted from inside the church. The sound of it was peaceful, almost otherworldly, and it filled him with a quiet sense of calm. Just as he reached the steps of the church, a sudden, unexpected noise caught his attention. A voice, sharp and authoritative, cutting through the stillness of the night. "What are you doing here?" The voice was calm, but firm. Jason froze. His body stiffened, his heart suddenly racing. He turned, startled, to see a policeman standing behind him, his hands resting on his belt, his eyes studying Jason with the calm, practiced demeanor of someone used to handling people on the edge. Jason opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. For a moment he just stood there staring at the officer, unable to make a sound. The officer didn't move. He just waited, his gaze fixed on Jason, waiting for a response. Jason took a deep breath, his mind scrambling to find the words. The plan he had been so desperate to make work, flashed through his mind again. But now, standing in front of the officer, something had shifted. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about the cold, or the escape, or the warmth of a jail cell. He was thinking about the change that was beginning to stir inside him, about the fleeting, fragile hope that had appeared in front of the church. He was thinking about how he had never really wanted to be here in the first place. Jason started, his voice hoarse, unsure. "I'm just looking for something." The policeman didn't react, but there was a slight shift in his expression, as if he understood the weight of Jason's words more than Jason himself could. The officer stepped closer, his eyes softening just slightly. "You've been out here a long time, haven't you?" the officer said, his voice almost gentle, but with a note of weariness. "It's getting late and cold." Jason nodded, swallowing, hard. The words seemed to stick in his throat. "I wasn't doing anything," Jason managed to say. "Just standing here." The officer looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he sighed, his expression softening. "Well, you're not going to find what you're looking for out here," he said quietly. "You're better off inside." Jason's breath caught in his throat. The officer's words seemed to sink into him, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to shift. He looked up at the church again, at the warm light spilling through the windows, and for the first time in a long time, he wondered if the officer's words were true. Could it really be this simple? Could he leave the streets behind, stop chasing the warmth of something that wasn't real and choose to make a change? The officer didn't wait for a response. Instead, he gave Jason a brief nod and walked away, his footsteps fading into the night. Jason watched him go, and for the first time he felt something that he hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. The warmth that Jason had been searching for, had been desperate for, hadn't been in the prison cell, hadn't been in the cold comfort of the streets. It had always been in the choices he made, the moments when he chose to take a step forward, to seek out something better, something real. Without another word, Jason turned back to the church and stepped up onto the steps. The music from inside grew louder, filling the cold night air with its beauty. As he opened the door and stepped inside, he felt the warmth of the room envelope him, a warmth he had never truly known until now. Great work today! Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.